Somehow, I had expected something more eloquent from a woman who teaches creative writing at the local community college. The room was dark, very dark, and I could barely make out Sally sitting in my favorite recliner, her legs pulled up and wrapped in a blanket. When I got closer, I saw that her hair was disheveled, her makeup was ruined, and she smelled like vomit. "Let me tell you what it looks like. Then you can correct any inaccuracies." My wife started to protest, but I yelled, "3, Akpoy, your mouth. I'll tell you when you can talk." I stood over her and started talking. I was going through customs with my team when 2 men in suits showed their badges and told me to go with them. They identified themselves as detectives from the Chicago Police Department and escorted me to one of the interview rooms of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. The older one followed me inside and closed the door. The room was empty except for a single chair. He said, "Have a seat." 3A team asked, "Where were you at 12 o'clock this afternoon?" Through a slit in the curtains, I could see a junior agent interviewing my team. I looked at him like he was an idiot. "You do realize I'm the captain of an airplane and I just landed from Paris. That's in France, not the suburbs of Joliet. Since I've flown through half a dozen time zones today, I assume you mean Chicago time. In that case, I was flying a Boeing 747, 200 at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. We were flying at 0.84 Maxa. Here's my logbook if you want to confirm that." I opened my briefcase and offered it to him. He wouldn't look at it. So I continued. "I had a crew of 14 and 416 passengers who can vouch for me. So, what exactly is all this about?" A younger agent came in and announced, "They all agree that he was flying the plane. It was amazing how quickly their attitudes changed when they realized how stupid they looked. Well, Captain, I'm sorry to inconvenience you, but we're investigating a murder." "Murder! No one died on my plane," I protested. "No, sir, earlier today. Since I've been in Europe the last couple days, I think I have a pretty good alibi." "Yes, sir. Then who says I killed someone?" "Your wife did." "What?" I screamed. My reaction was genuine because all my friend Angelo had to do was beat the shit out of the bastard, break his nose and jaw, too. "Oh, not kill him." "What? My wife said what? Who did my wife say I killed? Wait a minute. This is a joke, right?" "It's not a joke. I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but she said you killed her lover." I jumped up from my chair and shouted in his face, "Lover? You mean lover?" He didn't budge an inch. "Yes, sir." "It's not funny. My wife is faithful. She would never cheat on me. You've got the wrong man. You must have me confused with someone else." "I'm sorry, Captain, but your wife said she was sure it was you. She said you beat him to death in your driveway with a baseball bat." "How? I was on the airplane. She knew that. She knows I was in France. Explain that to me." "I'm sorry, but she said she thought you changed your trip when you found out she was having an affair." "Stop saying that!" I yelled. "My wife is not having an affair. She would never betray our wedding vows." The detectives stared at me with incomprehensible looks. I guess they'd seen too many deaths to show compassion. I fell back in my chair and started sobbing. "Anyway, it looks like your wife was played by a pro. Bastard preyed on women whose husbands spent a lot of time traveling. It's probably no consolation, but we have 3 more husbands to interview." Hearing this spoken aloud in a cold, impassive voice, my heart felt like it was being ripped out of my chest. I bent in half in agony. One of the detectives put his hand on my shoulder and asked, "Captain, is there anyone I can call for you?" "I want to talk to my whore wife." I threw my fists in the air. "I don't think that's too good an idea until you cool off." The older detective whispered something in YXO to his partner and left the room. When he returned, he apologized and said they had to go. "Wait, before you go, who was he?" The older detective pulled a tattered notebook out of his jacket pocket and flipped through it. "One Michael Wakeman, 30 years old. He was the same age as our son. If I may ask one more question, did he die quickly or did he suffer?" A sadistic smile slid across his face. "His attacker lured him outside by torching his brand-new Corvette convertible. Wakeman ran out your side door in his underwear. First swing of the baseball bat hit him across the chest. Me says he broke several ribs. The next one broke his back. Then his attacker flipped him over and kicked him several times in the groin. Shortly before the car exploded, he delivered a fatal blow to his skull. Paramedics said he was still moaning and spewing blood from his ears and mouth when they got there. He lingered for a couple minutes before his heart failed. So yeah, He didn't die peacefully at all. I tried not to make my smile too obvious. I should probably warn you that your wife may not be there when you get home. The house was damaged when Wakeman's car exploded. All the windows on that side were blown out, and there was some fire damage. Part of me wanted to scream with joy, but instead I covered my face with my hands and started sobbing again. Reality hit me, and I stayed in that room, unable to move until someone from INS knocked on the door and said they needed a room. Somehow I managed to find my car and drive home. Or what was left of it. So now you tell me what's wrong with the way it looks. A month earlier, a quiet suburb west of Chicago. In the late 1960s, there was a TV show called Bewitched. One of its quirky characters was Gladys Kravitz, a local resident who was often shown peeking out from behind the curtains in the Stevens house. In my neighborhood, the role of Gladys is played by Angelo D'Agostino, an elderly widower who lives directly across the street from my house. Ever since Marie, his wife of 52 years, died last fall, Angelo has spent his time keeping track of comings and goings. On weather days, he sits on his porch and greets passers-by. When the weather is bad, he sits in the house by the window and waves to everyone. Today was July 15th, and the weather was perfect. Angelo was keeping watch, dressed in an old shirt, black shorts, and knee-length black socks. Most people, especially my wife, avoided him like the plague because he's a damn repulsive type. Since I was away on long business trips several times a month, I was grateful to Angelo for looking after my house. He always waited for me to come home and initiated me into the local gossip. I usually gave him an inexpensive gift from my trip. German chocolate and coffee were very well received. He stood up as I pulled into my driveway and waved for me to come over. He seemed eager to share some gossip, so I left my bags in the trunk and crossed the street. Your friend has a really nice Corvette. A friend? What friend? The one who parked in your driveway yesterday. I would have thought Sally would have told you because she invited him in. He showed up at 12 sharp and stayed exactly 3 hours. What did this friend look like? Handsome. Typical playboy with the fancy mirrored sunglasses, well-dressed, khaki pants, and a polo shirt. I tried to think of who it could be. My guess was that one of the other pilots wanted to make me jealous. But who? And why did he have to stay so long? And why hadn't Sally mentioned anything about it when we were talking? I guessed that the mystery driver wanted to surprise me with his fiberglass toy, so I asked her not to say anything. I was in our bedroom unpacking my bags when Sally came home from the store. She ran up the stairs and hugged me, almost knocking me down. "How's my lover boy?" To say it was a much warmer greeting than I usually received would be putting it mildly. Soon we were engulfed in passion, and all thoughts of mysterious cars were forgotten. We spent the rest of the week as newlyweds. Sally was the perfect wife and lover, and when we went out to dinner, she wore one of the outfits I had bought, which she called inappropriate for a 48-year-old woman. She was even wearing nylon stockings and garters, I discovered, which she wasn't wearing when she got out of the car. When I left for work the following Wednesday, my sex drive was fully satisfied. She even slipped a romantic note in my suitcase. On that trip, I was the happiest guy in the friendly skies. I couldn't wait to get home. Unfortunately, Angelo dropped the bomb on me again. That friend of yours on the Corvette stopped by again yesterday. I pressed him for more details. He's a younger guy. He laughed and said, "Well, everyone's younger than me. I think he'd be about 30, maybe 35. He also seems to be in good shape, very punctual. Got here at noon and stayed until 3. Who the hell was this mysterious visitor? I thought. Once again, Sally came home while I was unpacking. I walked down the stairs and was rewarded with a bear hug and Sally's tongue down my throat. As I opened the hug to catch my breath, Sally announced that she was going to cook a culinary masterpiece for me from a recipe she found in a magazine. She had bought a couple of expensive steaks and was going to feed me like a real man. She has to run to the grocery store for the last ingredient. "But you take it easy while I cook," she purred, handing me a beer. Red lights flashed and alarms howled in my head. In 30 years of marriage, my wife had never once brought me a beer or told me to relax when I got home from a trip. She always had a to-do list to hand me before I even took off my uniform. That quiet voice in my head said she was feeling guilty and trying to make herself feel better. I decided to poke around a bit to see if I could find anything wrong. As soon as her car pulled out of the driveway, I ran outside and started rummaging through the trash cans to see if I could find anything. I didn't know what exactly I was looking for. Maybe empty condom wrappers. They weren't filled with anything but normal everyday trash. I went back to our room and began carefully going through the drawers of her underwear. Sally had never given me the slightest reason to question her fidelity, so I felt guilty going through her underwear. Nothing. I checked the bedside table. Just the same crap that had been there for years. Then I opened the hamper in Sally's bathroom. It was empty. Then I noticed that the bedding was freshly laundered. That seemed odd to me since it had been changed the morning I left, but I would need much more than clean sheets to confront her. I spent a few minutes going through all her shoeboxes. Damn, that woman has a lot of shoes. To no avail either. I looked through her closet but didn't notice anything new. Everything looked normal. I had to cut my investigation short when I heard the door open. "Where's my jet driver?" she called out. I decided to wait until morning to see if Sally had mentioned her mysterious visitor. After all, I knew there had to be a simple explanation. I was glad I waited because she was a Mahara in bed that night. At breakfast, I tried to make a few unexpected remarks to her without being too flippant, but she never once embarrassed herself. I got a very bad feeling in the bottom of my stomach. After lunch, Sally said she had to run to the store to get something for dinner. I declined her invitation to join her because I needed to be home alone for a while. As soon as she left, I resumed my search for clues, starting with the laundry room. There were 2 baskets there, one filled with Sally's clothes and the other with our bedding. This was 2 weeks in a row where all potential evidence was laundered. I had to figure out a way to shut off the washer so it wouldn't happen a third time. I decided to get active. Ever since the airline started flying to Paris, Sally had been pushing for me to take her there. Since it was a new destination, I didn't have a flight to Paris, but I was able to barter with another pilot. When I told Angelo I was flying to Paris the following week, his eyes lit up and he told me stories about liberating the City of Lights. I learned that his one weakness was Chateau de Montifaux cognac, an addiction he developed when he served in France during World War II. Unfortunately, the retiree's Social Security checks only allowed him to buy the domestic variety from a local liquor store. That night during dinner, I had a surprise of my own. I told Patty that I had changed my next flight from Frankfurt to Paris and invited her to fly with me. I promised her a day of shopping on the Champs-Élysées, then dinner at the Jules Verne restaurant at the top of the Eiffel Tower, followed by a romantic moonlight cruise on the Seine River. Sally flatly refused me. When I asked her why she didn't want to fly, she hummed and mumbled something vague about being too busy to go. I begged her to change her schedule and asked, what could be so important that it couldn't wait? Again, she challenged me and said, maybe we could do this another time. Things were not going well in our marriage. For the rest of the week, I was more zombie than human. I couldn't look at Sally without bile coming to my mouth. During the night, I rejected her advances. She kept asking me what was wrong. I never answered. On the morning of the day of my trip, I made another attempt to talk Sally into spending a romantic 36 hours in Paris. I put my hands on her shoulders, looked straight into her eyes, and pleaded, "Please pick me." And again, she said, "No." I almost told her my suspicions, but I knew I couldn't prove them, so I held my tongue. The last thing I did before I left was cut the cold water hose for the washing machine. Not very hard, but enough to discourage Sally from doing laundry. He started spraying water all over the wall. The laundry room floor was sloped toward the drain, and when the water rose a couple inches, water ran down it. I closed the door and was pleased to see that it wasn't seeping under the wall. Sally would have to go to the laundry room to detect the flooding. On the way to the airport, I was immersed in my thoughts and a little worried about whether I would be able to concentrate enough to fly the plane. Hundreds of people were putting their lives in my hands, and I was doing my best to suppress everything but doing my job. My co-pilot realized something was wrong after we lifted off and offered to take over the controls. I said I must have been sick with something and took an early break. The crew has a rest area in the back of the plane, and I spent the next hour tearing my soul apart. When we landed, I apologized for being sick and said I would spend all my rest in bed. Angelo said the visitor arrived at 12 sharp. I took a calculated risk. He had a reason to stick to that schedule, and called home at exactly 12:02, hoping against all odds that Sally would answer or at least listen to my message as it was recorded. It was picked up by the answering machine after the second beep. "You have reached the Rockwell residence. Please leave a message and we will get back to you as soon as possible." I began, "Sally, my beloved, I am in the most romantic city in the world, but without you I might as well be in—" I never got to finish the sentence as the recorder turned me off. I dialed 0 for the outside line, then the country code, followed by my city code and home phone number. The phone kept ringing, which meant someone had turned off the answering machine. I could only hope that when they heard my voice, they would end their date. True to my word, I never once left the room during my entire stop. By the time I was sitting in the cockpit, I had come to terms with the demise of my marriage. For a change, Sally was home when I returned from my trip, except she looked like a drowned rat. Without even saying hello, she started loudly telling me how the basement had been flooded and everything downstairs destroyed. She got very upset when I told her I would look at the basement after I changed out of my uniform. I have to admit, I was curious as to why the water didn't go down the drain. I put on my cropped jeans and t-shirt, then went to the garage to get my boots. The first thing I noticed was the laundry basket on the table. I could see our sheets along with a pair of Sally's panties on top. I discreetly slipped them into my pocket. Water was whipping from the copper water fitting, so I asked Sally why she had disconnected the hose instead of closing the faucet. Her answer wasn't very coherent. I found the drain and pulled out some rags that plugged it. Soon, a swirl of water formed in the water. I sighed as I watched the water level drop. I told Sally to go upstairs and make some coffee. I used the time to examine the gusset on the panties I had pulled out. It was covered in sex marks. I damn near put a hole in the wall, but kept my cool long enough to inspect the sheets. There was a big stain right in the middle. I moved the basket to where it wasn't easily visible and started running through the inevitable confrontation in my mind as I went through the wet stuff. I pulled out a large plastic garbage bag and began stuffing things into it. 10 minutes later, I was pulling the bags of junk to the curb when Angelo beckoned me over. "Let's go inside. We need to talk." It was the first time I'd ever been invited into his house. He motioned for me to sit down. "Captain." Angelo always called me Captain. "I've known you since the day you were born. Your parents were closer to me than most of my family." He squeezed his hands tightly. "I don't know any easy way to tell you this, but your wife has been unfaithful. When the man in the red Corvette arrived yesterday, I crossed the street and looked in your living room window. I'm sorry to tell you this, but they were kissing, undressing each other. I watched until they ran upstairs. My worst fears were confirmed. It pains me deeply to see how she disrespected you. My friend, I will try to put this as delicately as possible. A betrayal such as this cannot go unpunished. I have, shall we say, connections with a group of individuals who operate outside the law. Some of these people have been indebted to me since we were in business together many years ago. My friend, all you have to do is say the word and that son of a bitch will never bother your wife again. I swear on the eyes of my grandchildren that no one will lay a finger on her, but she will learn her lesson." I remembered muttering something like, "Thank you, but I'm afraid it's too late." Angelo took my hands in his and said, "But it's not too late to keep her from hurting you again." I turned and nodded my head. "Do it." We spent a few minutes discussing my schedule so I wouldn't be around when justice was served. I was a blur as I made my way back to my house. Later that night, I remembered that the bottle of cognac I had bought was still in my car. I was still riddled with excitement from our earlier conversation and wondered relentlessly if he was serious. I left the box on Angelo's porch, rang his doorbell, and then hurried back to my house so I wouldn't have to talk to him again. It was dark outside when I rounded the last corner in front of my house. Traffic was stopped by a police car blocking the road. An officer approached and said, "Excuse me, sir, but only locals are allowed inside." I pulled out my wallet and handed the officer my driver's license. He looked at the address, then at the name. His face changed to an awkward, embarrassed expression. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rockwell. I could see people standing on the lawns in front of their houses pointing at me as I drove by, some waving at me. There were a couple of big TV station trucks parked on the street, and in my driveway were the remains of a burned-out Corvette, so I had to park a couple doors down from them." As I got closer, one of the reporters noticed my uniform, and I was soon the center of attention with a dozen questions being shouted out at once. The loudest one kept shouting, "Did you kill him?" I raised my hand and began to speak. The flashes blinded me for a moment. Earlier today, the Chicago Police Department informed me that my wife was having an affair and her lover was murdered in my driveway. It happened while I was on an airplane over the Atlantic Ocean, so, no, I didn't kill him. But I would like to thank whoever rid society of this piece of human garbage. I rehearsed that line all the way home and hoped I'd get a chance to use it. The policeman yelled, "Let him through!" I thanked him and walked across the yard, stopping for a minute to survey the damage. I thought it would be a good photo opportunity. All the windows were blown out and my garage was a burned-out shell. Fortunately, the sturdy brick walls kept the fire from spreading inside the house. I opened the door and stepped inside. "So now you tell me what's wrong with the way it looks." Sally wiped her face with her sleeve. She looked like shit. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." "That's impossible," shouted I. "It was supposed to be you and me against the world." I fell to my knees, sobbing. "You destroyed us. You destroyed our family, our life together. You destroyed everything." Sally didn't answer, but I could hear her struggling for air. Her breathing was like that of an asthmatic who needed an inhaler. "Why? Why? Why?" I covered my face with my hands and tried to catch my breath. Sally started spewing apologies, swearing she loved me. "I don't know why. You're the only man I've ever loved. I'm so sorry I hurt you. I wanted to hurt my wife as much as she hurt me. You knew your buddy was married and his wife was 9 months pregnant. Their child would grow up without a father because of you." "Oh, God, no!" she screamed. "You knew you weren't the only whore he was sleeping with. The detectives said they had several other husbands who were suspects. You were just another whore to him." She made a sorrowful sound I'd never heard from a human being. I swear I was going to break up with him. Today would have been the end of it. I felt so guilty for turning down a trip to Paris. I told her to shut her lying mouth. "You felt guilty because you didn't go to Paris. You should have felt guilty for being a whore. And when exactly were you going to break up? After you screwed him? I know the police found him in his underwear, so don't lie to me." Sally started moaning. "I'm so sorry. Please forgive me, please. I just had the funniest thought." "If you really felt guilty about canceling your trip to Paris, you would have broken up with him before you let that bastard into our house for goodbye sex. If you had done that, he would have been murdered in someone else's house, and you would have gone unpunished because I would never have suspected a thing. I would have continued to act like a blissful idiot, thinking my wife was faithful to me." "Well, whore, how many other men have you screwed during our marriage and gotten away with it? I swear to God, he's the only one in the world. Why should I believe you?" Sally clutched her stomach and bent in half as if she was going to throw up. "I never thought I'd say this, but my mother was right about you. She hated you from the first moment she met you. Do you remember that day? It was 3 months after our graduation, and you came to tell me you missed your period. Mom said you did it on purpose to trap me. But even though she had nothing but contempt for you, she opened her home to you. I can't tell you how many times she slipped me a few dollars because she knew I didn't have a penny in my account. She always made me promise not to tell you she paid for baby food. And when I became a pilot flying night flights, who looked after our son so you could go to college? I always wanted to prove my mom wrong. I was sick of her treating you like an outcast, fawning over my brother's wives. But I always stood up for you because we were a team. We were one. When you became a professor, I glowed with pride at what you had accomplished. That was the first time I saw her proud of what you were doing. Now I thank God she didn't live to see you destroy us." Sally screamed, "Oh God, why? You know my father died when I was barely 12. One night when I was about 15, I asked my mom why she still wore her wedding rings. Before she could answer, I said what only a stupid teenager would say, 'Mom, you don't look that old. You should go out on a date.' She smiled, wrapped her arms around my hands with her own, and said, 'I can't do that because I'm married. We swore in front of God and all our friends and family to leave everyone else behind. But Daddy is dead. Nothing has changed. Your dad lives in my heart as much as he did when he lived in our house.' I told her I didn't understand. She just smiled and said she would pray that someday I did. It took me a long time to grow up enough to begin to understand the depth of their love and how their devotion went beyond the grave. I never told you this, but on my first flight, a flight attendant invited me to have a drink with her during our layover. She was stunningly gorgeous and I was tempted. But only for a moment. I thought of my mom, showed her my engagement ring and said, I can't do this because I'm married. I've never seen more perfect love than my parents have. I used to think we had it all worked out. Now you've destroyed us. All I have left for you is hate. Sally managed to stop crying long enough to speak. Please, I'll do anything to make it up to you. Anything? Okay, just go back in time to the moment when Crip began his seduction. I want you to change history. I want you to tell him to back off because you're happily married. I want you to tell him that your husband has the swankiest job in the world and treats you like a queen. I want you to tell him to go home to his pregnant wife. I want you to tell him that if he ever talks to you again, your husband will kick his ass. Can you do that? Sally, sobbing, fell to her knees. She shook her head negatively. I don't think you can do that. Please forgive me. Please. I'm going to leave. I don't know where I'm going, but I have to get away from you. Sally lunged at me and grabbed my ankle. No, please, 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 she begged. Let me go or I'll break your damn arm. She loosened her grip and I turned around and headed for the door. When the door opened, she screamed, He'd better kill me too! The whore must have read my mind!